What about qualitative risk assessment? Exactly because it's difficult, if not impossible, to quantify every variable, it's also very useful to use qualitative methods of risk management. So here's a way of doing that that's in the literature, and that was in the training course that I took, that I think is really helpful for you to think about. So what you want to do is you want to gather together relevant subject matter experts, and kind of in the lingo, SMEs, right? They love acronyms in this field. Maybe because it seems like a lot of people who are involved in this field are kind of ex-military people or ex-government people, so maybe that's why they love the acronyms. So SMEs, and present scenarios to them, kind of like the tabletop, and have them give their opinions about the severity and likelihood of various risk events occurring, and that will give you some kind of gauge of how to prioritize risk management. So how would you do that? Well, it's useful to have some kind of tool that might help you do that, and here's a way in this field that it often is done. So you can, on the one side, you can sort of put together a grid like this. On the one side, you have the subject matter expert rank the likelihood of a particular risk being realized. And you can use any scale you want. This example uses a scale of 1 to 5, right? So 1 on the bottom, 5 on the top. And it's really just an opinion, right? So you're asking this, maybe the subject matter expert is someone in the Chief Information Security Officer's office. Maybe it's the CISO, him or herself, or somebody in their office. Okay, what's the likelihood of a virus infecting our system? Well, the likelihood is really high. It's a 4, or it's really high. It's a 5, or it's low. It's a 2, right? So it's just an opinion. Then on the bottom, you can see is the severity or impact of a given event occurring. Again, on a scale of 1 to 5. And then what you would do is you'd say, all right, let's say that the likelihood was ranked as a 4 and the severity was ranked as a 3. Then you would have a total score of 7. You can see in this particular tool, I color-coded it. That can be useful, right? So you see the 7 is kind of yellow, danger, right? But it's not red yet, but it's yellow. All right, so that's just a way of doing it. Now, what about the far right side, kind of bright red? And you'll see those numbers are in the 90s. And then on the severity impact level, you can see there's an extra box that's number 90, and under that says CMF. CMF means critical mission failure. 90 is just an arbitrary high number. I mean, you could put 100 in there, you could put 1,000 in there, it doesn't really matter. The idea here is that if any of the SMEs say, well, if this particular risk were realized, our business basically would crash and burn, then I'm going to rank that a 90 or 100 or 1,000 or whatever it is, right? So anything that's in that column is going to be critical mission failure. Now, as we're kind of going through doing this with your subject matter experts, you're going to end up with scores, average scores, for various kinds of risk. And if you do have anything that ends up falling into the CMF category, the critical mission factor category, then that's almost certainly something that has to be immediately and rapidly addressed. Even higher than something that's a 10. A 10 is pretty high. It's in a maroon kind of category on my chart here, right? That's a serious risk. It's going to rank higher than an 8 or a 6 or a 4 or a 2, and that means in all likelihood it's something that's going to have to be addressed sooner and with more resources than those other things. But even with that, if it's in the 90s, it's absolutely critical that it immediately be addressed. So I think you can see how a tool like this could be usefully used. Now, here's just a little example. This is completely made up, just to show you how it might work. So, let's say you gathered 5 subject matter experts I didn't identify who they are here. In the final problem, if you do the PowerPoint, you'll see that I include some information about particular subject matter experts. And let's say here are the numbers. So again, what you're doing is you're asking each one, and I have here some general categories. A virus versus the threat of hacktivism affecting our company's websites and so on. So each expert will rank likelihood and severity. It's not unusual that different subject matter experts from different areas of the enterprise might give differing assessments. You're going to go down and average all of those, and you'll end up with a total average from all of your experts. So you can see here that for the virus, the total average across your experts is 8.2. You round it off, 8, right? For hacktivism, it's 4.8 or 5. You could then go to the chart and kind of illustrate. All right, in 8, we're kind of in the yellow zone. That's it's not quite in the maroon zone. It's not in the CMF zone, but it's important. And 5, we're kind of in the orange zone. It's something we're going to need to address. But given that we have limited resources and limited time, we probably want to put more time and resources up front into virus prevention and detection and mitigation than into concerns about hacktivism. It's not that we're going to ignore hacktivism, right? But you can see it's a way of qualitatively ranking risk. You can do this kind of thing in conjunction with quantitative and run tabletops, which help identify some of the stuff that might filter into these sorts of tools. And then you're beginning to not just kind of brainstorm and make stuff up. You're beginning to put some real meat on the bones, some even though they're kind of made up numbers in a sense, but at least some rankings and prioritization and some more thoughtful, thought out efforts at management. And the more thoughtful and thought out efforts there are at managing these kinds of risks, then on the back end, on the stuff that concerns us as on the legal side of the organization, the less likely and the less substantial our legal exposure is likely to be. Now, one other thing I want to note about this before we wrap up this lecture, this example that I gave you, you can see that both in likelihood and severity, the numbers are relatively similar across the different subject matter experts. What do you do if one of the subject matter experts seems to be totally giving a different evaluation than the others? So let's say, for example, that you've got 4 subject matter experts who are in risk management, legal, CISO's office, and they're all giving a relatively high likelihood and relatively high severity for a virus. Then you've got someone in sales, and the person in sales is giving a 2 for likelihood and severity. And that's an outlier, right? So in statistical terms, if you're familiar with that, it's potentially an outlier. And that means that skewed number, whether it's very much lower than the rest or very much higher than the rest, might distort the overall average. So you want to think about, if you do see that kind of skewed number, what does the result look like with that number included? What does the result look like with that number not included? Are there some explanations you might give for why it's an outlier? I use sales as an example on purpose because salespeople tend to be sort of accepting of lots of kinds of risks, or not evaluate risks as highly maybe as lawyers and computer techies and so on, right? So that's not uncommon. And so you might say, well, if I exclude this one, results in a much higher priority, and you might have some reasons to exclude it. All right, so think about that. Last piece of all of this, the final decision concerning what needs to be done and what ought to be done resides with senior management. Very often, much of the time, as the lawyer in this kind of role, you're not making the final decision. Or if you're in compliance or risk management, you're not making the final decision, you're making recommendations. And this ties into the philosophy of the NIST framework, right? The recommendations for cybersecurity risks ultimately ought to go up to the C-suite. And, at the highest levels of the organization, then, taking into account all of their risks and plans and goals and resources, they need to make decisions about, what kind of protection, what kind of detection, and what kind of response they need to be involved in. This is the end of the lecture.